I personally agree with the second view, the more substantive definition approach to rule of law, because I think the formalistic view of rule of law, as I will talk about in the next point here, is very lacking. It's very lacking. If you can tell somebody that the southern governments, the southern states, were indeed following the rule of law within the Jim Crow South, it just sounds a bit repugnant. Or the idea that apartheid South Africa was a respectable government following the rule of law when those laws were excluding more than half of the population of the country from its benefit, it just strikes someone as being repugnant. Now, you will say whether it is repugnant or not is an issue of taste. Well, maybe. But law and morality are not that far apart. And for that matter, lawyers, more than anybody else, acknowledge the strong link there is between laws and morality. Political morality, natural law, the link is very, very close. You take that out of the law, you take the law without its breath. Its life goes away. Law needs natural law. Law needs morality. Without it, there is no life in the law. It becomes actually tyranny. Now that we all know what rule of law is, or at least the two conceptions of rule of law, how does rule of law then impact economic development in a country like the Congo or any other country that's trying to fight poverty and develop into a stronger economy? Now, there is plentiful literature about this. A lot has been written over the last 20 years about rule of law and about the nexus between rule of law and economic development. It looks like the strong interest in studying the nexus between rule of law and economic development came about kind of in the late 80s. Apparently, economists used to think that all you needed to get development right was good policies. As long as you have good policies in place, good macroeconomic policies, just go ahead, implement them, good labor policies, good tax policies, all will be well. And then after the Asia crisis happened in the 80s, they realized that that's not the case. The policies were right. What was wrong? Institutions were lacking. The institutional backing was not there to sustain the policies. Hence the need to look for the missing link. And that was rule of law, or at least rule of law that leads to stronger institutions, better governance, and then you can have sustainable economic development. A very good article was written published by The Economist, the UK weekly, sometime in March of 2008. If you want to get a 3-page easy read on this topic, the nexus between economic development and the rule of law, go look up that article either in your Lexis search or maybe even online. You can find it. Nice article. It kind of gives you a rundown of how the thought progressed and what the different groups of thinkers think about this. But the bottom line seems to be this. Regardless of how you define rule of law, whether you ascribe to the more formalistic definition or you ascribe to the substantive, broader definition of rule of law, it is a necessary element, at least a necessary element to realize economic development. Economic development requires a number of things to be in place. And one of them is the expectation that people's private property will be protected. And the expectation that if I enter into a contract, the state will give me the means to enforce it if the other side does not abide by their end of the bargain. And the expectation that if I go to court, an impartial judge will hear me. Now, you need those three things in order to create sustainable, again, I underline sustainable, economic development. Research has established and a slew of data gathered by the World Bank Governance Group, the World Bank Institute Global Governance Group. They published a very interesting annual report, World Governance Report, where they rank countries by rule of law and other governance metrics and so forth. And it is clear that the countries that are the wealthiest are also the countries that have better rule of law. Now, that's not causation, it may just be a correlation. But it is there. The countries that have the most wealth also have the better rule of law. And in that Economist article I mentioned to you, in 2008, when they published this, they said, well, except two countries that seem to break this rule, really, there were other countries that are not as wealthy but have better rule of law. And those two countries are Greece and Italy. If you are following the news today, you know what's happening in Greece and Italy. And it was interesting because they were the laggard and rule of law in Europe, and see where they are ending. They are amongst the worst performing economies in the European market today. And so the data seems to support at least the correlation that there is this solid link between rule of law and economic development. Now, it would make sense that there be such a link. And it would make sense that the rule of law be an ingredient that supports economic development. Again, economic development will come in a free society, in a free economy, in a place where people can do the things just described, enter into contracts, invest freely, and have their investment protected. The more they get those things, the more you will get the things that they bring, investment. And in theory, the more you should get economic development out of that. So it kind of makes sense that there will be that at least link in theory. However, there are some countries that have not had great rule of law experiences who have experienced some amount of economic development. And people tend to mention China. We'll talk about this maybe in the Q&A session. But even in the case of China, I will argue, and some other scholars have argued, that even in the case of China, you still have a minimal level of rule of law, at least this rule of law formalistic side with respect to contracts, and some modicum level of private property rights as well, as having been introduced to support this new boom that has happened. Some minimal amount of change were necessary to allow the Chinese boom to happen, and those changes were geared toward making it look a little bit like a rule of law environment. And that change has continued. But that being as it may, my contention is that for that development to be sustainable, you need more than those formalistic changes. You need the fundamental, substantive rule of law type. Because if you do not implement the fundamental type changes, it is difficult to sustain the economic growth that you will get, that you may get only from having implemented the formalistic changes. What will happen? What will happen is a country has an economy that is growing fast, and wealth is created. But because people do not have the freedoms that they think they should have, they don't have the freedom to express their mind, freedom to innovate, to act, to start up businesses, what will happen is the system will slow down by itself, or will be brought down by revolt from people who are not getting their share of the spoil in the system. And a system that does not encourage freedom and the civil liberties that the International Commission of Jurists kind of said must be part of the rule of law, a system that does not encourage those things is by nature oppressive to some of the people in the country. And oppression is not a way to build wealth in the long term. It is just the opposite. Oppression is a guaranteed way to prepare yourself for revolt. And that revolt may be so much so that it brings down the entire system. That's what to be sustainable, that's why I said I underline the word sustainable. To be sustainable, development must be underpinned by true rule of law changes that include substantive changes, substantive rules that promote freedom, that promote civil liberties, and that promote the expansion of human dignity.